Imagine the U.S. government makes just a colossal $80 billion financial bet on domestic nuclear energy, but then the market completely rejects it.
Right, like nobody wants it at all.
Exactly. Nobody wants to buy the infrastructure. The investment is totally tanking. So, how far would the government actually go to bail itself out?
That's the big question.
Would they actually cross the line of international nuclear proliferation? Well, according to the viral video commentary we are unpacking today, the answer is a terrifying yes.
Yeah, it's a wild claim.
The source we're looking at basically claims that a failed federal investment is currently the hidden engine driving a massive, highly controversial nuclear agreement with Saudi Arabia.
It really completely upends how we usually think about foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we are taught to view international diplomacy through the lens of, national security or human rights or geographic strategy.
Sure.
But the author of this commentary is arguing that we should be looking at it through the lens of a desperate corporate ledger.
Right, follow the money. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to pull apart this single, highly provocative source for you. The author connects dots that seem completely unrelated at first glance, like U.S. defense spending, Chinese oil reserves, a stranded domestic nuclear asset, and uranium enrichment in the Middle East.
A lot to untangle.
It is. But before we jump in, a quick but crucial impartiality disclaimer for you listening. This source material contains some incredibly intense political critiques.
Oh, absolutely.
The author takes aim at figures across the entire political spectrum, left-wing, right-wing, and specifically calls out the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations. So we want to be crystal clear here. We are not taking sides.
We are absolutely not endorsing the author's political framing or their ultimate conclusions. Our goal today is just to impartially report on the claims being made, map out the underlying logic of the argument, and basically help you understand how this author got from point A to point Z.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the central, bold hypothesis of this source claims that current U.S. geopolitical maneuvers in the Middle East aren't about traditional diplomacy at all.
Right.
They are structurally designed to recoup a bad financial investment.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to start where the author starts, which is the domestic American economy. The video actually opens with the author taking a bit of a victory lap, claiming a macroeconomic hypothesis they made 4 months ago was 100% correct.
And that premise focuses entirely on the U.S. gross domestic product, or GDP, right?
Exactly.
The author claims that the Q3 and Q4 U.S. GDP is currently being artificially propped up by massive increases in defense spending. But, as a listener, you're probably wondering how pumping out weapons translates to saving the economy.
Well, it really comes down to how GDP is actually calculated. GDP measures the total monetary value of all finished goods and services produced within a country. And one of the massive pillars of that calculation is government spending. So when the government signs these multi-billion-dollar contracts with defense contractors to build missile systems, fighter jets, munitions, whatever, that money immediately injects into the economy.
Right, because they have to actually build stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The manufacturers hire workers, they buy raw materials, that capital circulates, and boom, your GDP numbers look robust on paper for that quarter.
It sounds like a company buying its own inventory to artificially inflate its quarterly sales numbers, right?
That's a great way to look at it, yeah.
You make the balance sheet look great, but now you have warehouses just full of high-tech defense systems. You need a buyer. And the author points out that you might assume Israel is the biggest beneficiary of all this production, given the current headlines.
Right. Seems obvious.
But the source emphatically claims it's not Israel. The biggest beneficiary taking these systems is Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia is absorbing this massive output, which gives them incredible geopolitical leverage. And the author layers another massive global dynamic on top of this, which is China.
Right, China.
According to the video, China is currently facing a severe depletion of its oil reserves, and the country stepping in to backfill that energy deficit. Saudi Arabia.
So Saudi Arabia is standing at the exact intersection of America's defense manufacturing output and China's desperate energy needs.
Exactly.
The source then takes this into some highly aggressive foreign policy territory.
Yeah.
The author asserts that Saudi Arabia is the primary beneficiary of the U.S., and this is the author's exact phrasing here, invading Venezuela and capturing Maduro and invading Iran.
Yeah, the underlying logic the author is presenting is that these aren't isolated national security flashpoints. I mean, if the U.S. takes an aggressive military posture against major oil-producing nations like Iran or Venezuela, it destabilizes their output.
Which chokes the global supply.
Right. That restricted global supply inherently benefits Saudi Arabia, cementing their role as the indispensable oil supplier to powers like China, while simultaneously justifying the continued U.S. defense spending that keeps the domestic GDP afloat.
But wait, if Saudi Arabia is already acting as this massive geopolitical sponge, like absorbing U.S. defense contracts, cornering the Chinese oil market, benefiting from U.S. pressure on Venezuela and Iran, why do they suddenly care about American nuclear energy?
That is the big pivot.
Like, how does a domestic U.S. power plant connect to this massive Middle Eastern web?
That is the exact pivot the author makes, taking us back to November, when the Trump administration announced a staggering $80 billion federal investment in Westinghouse, which is a major American nuclear energy company.
$80 billion.
Yeah. The stated goal was to massively expand U.S. nuclear energy infrastructure.
$80 billion is just an astronomical sum. But according to a recent Washington Post report the video cites, just days before this commentary was recorded, a bombshell dropped. Nobody was buying any of this expanded infrastructure.
Right. The investment basically created a massive stranded asset. They built the capacity, but there was zero market demand for the final product.
I have to push back on the author's framing here, though. The video points out that this agreement wasn't just a grant. It gave the U.S. government 20% ownership in Westinghouse's profits.
Right.
The author calls this a shitty investment rooted in state capitalism, but honestly, isn't taking an equity stake just a standard way to structure a massive federal bailout?
Well, it depends on how you look at it.
Because when the government bailed out the auto industry in 2008, they took stock. If taxpayers take the $80 billion risk, shouldn't they get 20% of the upside? Why is that so controversial here?
You're touching on a fundamental debate about the role of government in free markets. But to understand the author's specific outrage, we have to drill down into the mechanics of state capitalism.
Okay, let's hear it.
When the government bailed out the auto industry, the goal was to eventually sell those shares back and exit the market entirely. State capitalism, which the author explicitly associates with the Chinese economic model, operates differently.
How so?
It's when the state takes a permanent, direct financial stake in a private industry. They are fundamentally tying the government's own financial success to a specific corporate outcome.
I see. So the government is no longer just an impartial regulator of the nuclear energy sector. They are quite literally a shareholder.
Exactly.
If Westinghouse goes under, the government loses an $80 billion bet and their 20% revenue stream just vanishes.
And this changes the underlying motivation of the state entirely. According to the video, because the domestic and international markets organically rejected this nuclear expansion, the U.S. government had to artificially manufacture a market just to save their investment.
And the only buyer with enough capital and enough leverage over the U.S. economy right now is Saudi Arabia. The source claims that to save this $80 billion Westinghouse deal, a brand new agreement was formed allowing Saudi Arabia to pursue uranium enrichment with U.S. companies performing the enrichment for them.
We have to pause here and explain the mechanics of what enrichment actually means, because this is where the geopolitical stakes become existential.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the author drops a terrifying statistic. Enriching uranium constitutes 90% of the process required to build a nuclear weapon. But how does that actually work mechanically?
So natural uranium dug out of the ground is mostly made of an isotope called uranium-238, which is basically useless for a nuclear reaction.
Okay.
Only about 0.7% of it is uranium-235, and that's the isotope you actually need for power or weapons.
Got it.
Enrichment is the incredibly complex, highly expensive process of separating the two, usually by spinning it in these massive centrifuges, just to increase the concentration of U-235.
So for a normal civilian nuclear power plant, you need, what, about 3 to 5% enrichment?
It's exactly, somewhere around there. But for a nuclear weapon, you need highly enriched uranium, usually over 90% concentration.
Wait, so if civilian power only requires 5% and a bomb requires 90%, how does the author get away with claiming that providing civilian enrichment gets you 90% of the way to a weapon? The numbers seem backward.
It's a quirk of the physics involved. The technical effort required to go from natural uranium at 0.7% up to civilian grade at 5% actually takes up about 90% of the total physical work and centrifuge time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Once you have a stockpile of 5% enriched uranium, the remaining effort to spin it up to 90% weapons grade is comparatively trivial. It takes very little time.
So using a car analogy, it's not just selling them the tires.
Not at all.
If building a nuclear weapon is like building a Ferrari, The enrichment process is fabricating the entire engine block, the chassis, the transmission, and assembling the car. Going from civilian to weapons grade is basically just slapping a fresh coat of paint on it and turning the key. You've
Yeah.
essentially given them the bomb.
What's fascinating here is how the author uses that technical reality to frame the geopolitical shift. Allowing Saudi uranium enrichment is a massive concession that radically alters Middle Eastern security.
Absolutely.
But the author argues this concession wasn't made for strategic defense. It was a desperate, calculated move to ensure the $80 billion Westinghouse venture and the government's 20% profit share didn't go bankrupt.
They needed a customer so desperately they were willing to trade near weapons-grade nuclear capability just to balance the books.
It's the argument.
But this raises a massive logistical question for me, and probably for you listening. Handing the keys to a nuclear program over to a foreign nation in a highly volatile region sounds like the exact scenario Congress is designed to prevent. Why isn't the legislative branch slamming the brakes on this?
To explain that, the source dives into the structural precedents of U.S. foreign policy, specifically contrasting this new Saudi agreement with the 2009 U.S.-UAE agreement.
Right. The 2009 deal with the United Arab Emirates, that was initiated by the Bush administration and later expanded by the Obama administration.
Correct.
The video points out that the UAE agreement is universally considered the gold standard for nuclear cooperation because it strictly prohibited the UAE from enriching their own uranium or reprocessing plutonium. It explicitly blocked the pathway to a weapon.
But the author points out that this new agreement with Saudi Arabia effectively erases all of those carefully negotiated bipartisan restrictions.
Yeah.
It abandons the gold standard entirely.
And as for why Congress isn't stopping it, the video highlights a terrifying structural loophole regarding executive power. This new Saudi deal is structured in a way where Congress does not have to approve it to make it happen.
Right. Unlike a formal international treaty, which constitutionally requires a two-thirds supermajority vote in the Senate for ratification, this is structured as an executive agreement. The executive branch can move forward independently.
The video states that Congress's only recourse is to try and proactively pass legislation to block the deal. But even if they do, the president can just veto their block. Wait, I want to make sure I understand the mechanics of this loop.
Sure.
If the House and the Senate somehow miraculously manage to cross the aisle, rally together, and vote to block this enrichment agreement, the president can just pull out the veto pen and kill their block.
That is the mechanical reality of the situation, yes. To override a presidential veto, Congress would need a two-thirds supermajority in both chambers, which in today's hyper-partisan climate is virtually impossible.
So it's a completely closed loop where the executive branch holds all the cards.
And he also provides historical context to prove just how uncheckable this authority is. The video brings up a specific legislative attempt from 2018. Representative Brad Sherman of California introduced a bill literally called the No Nuclear Weapons for Saudi Arabia Act.
The entire point of the bill was to legally prevent a president from bypassing Congress on Saudi nuclear deals. The video notes it was even co-sponsored by Representative Ro Khanna.
But that legislation failed to pass.
Wow.
The author highlights this failure to demonstrate that because the legislative branch couldn't establish a statutory boundary back in 2018, the executive branch today is completely free to pursue these international deals. They can advance their state capitalist investments without asking for permission.
Which brings us to the ultimate conclusion of the source video. The author pivots from the terrifying reality of international nuclear proliferation to a profound frustration with domestic political hypocrisy.
Yes. The author draws a direct, unforgiving line between the U.S. government's 20% profit stake in Westinghouse and the economic practices of China. It is, by definition, state capitalism.
And the author notes the glaring irony here. This concept like government ownership and manipulation of private industry is the exact economic model that Republicans and Magier politicians loudly claim to be terrified of. It is the antithesis of the free market capitalism they champion.
Yet, as the author points out, instead of being outraged by this massive government-owned nuclear deal, a deal that fully embraces Chinese-style state capitalism and risks Middle Eastern nuclear proliferation, these exact same political factions are completely ignoring it.
The video ends on an incredibly stark, almost absurd contrast. The author says that while this multi-billion-dollar geopolitical nuclear proliferation deal is happening in plain sight, the political right is currently hyper-focused on and terrified by 5 subsidized grocery stores in New York City.
It is a critique of how easily public attention is manipulated.
So what does this all mean? Regardless of where you sit politically, the author is essentially painting a masterpiece of misdirection.
Yeah, that's a good way to phrase it.
The argument is that public outrage is being expertly managed. People are fighting tooth and nail over local subsidized grocery stores, while the executive branch quietly reorders global security just to protect a bad federal investment portfolio.
The narrative asserts that the American public is completely missing the fact that the government is employing the very economic model they supposedly disguise.
Right.
And worse, they are using that state capitalist model to justify foreign policy decisions that put a foreign kingdom 90% of the way toward a nuclear weapon.
It is a truly staggering journey this source takes us on. Just to recap how we got here for a second. We started with the idea that defense spending is artificially propping up the domestic GDP by funneling weapons to Saudi Arabia.
Yep.
Saudi Arabia leverages that position and their role backfilling China's oil depletion to demand a nuclear program. We then have an $80 billion failed American nuclear energy investment where the U.S. government holds a 20% ownership stake.
Right.
To save that investment from ruin, a Saudi nuclear deal is forged that completely bypasses Congress, erasing decades of non-proliferation precedent, all driven by state capitalism.
This raises an important question, one that the logic of this text forces us to consider long after we finish today. If the executive branch truly has the uncheckable authority to use international nuclear agreements as a bailout mechanism for domestic corporate investments, what does that mean for the future of global security? I mean, if foreign policy is no longer dictated by a strategic desire for peace, but by the desperate need to rescue a government's financial portfolio, we have to wonder what other global red lines might be crossed tomorrow just to ensure an investment pays out.
It's a chilling thought, and it perfectly illustrates why we dig into these sources. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep examining the narratives you're given, look closer at the mechanics behind the headlines, and always keep questioning the information around you. We'll catch you next time.